She was standing at my door when I opened it, and the first thing she did was look me directly in the eye and say, in flat, perfect English, "I am here. Sign the intake form." No hello, no smile, no introduction, just a slim silver tablet held out in one hand, and eyes the color of pale winter ice, staring at me, like I was a problem she had already calculated the solution to. I blinked, then I took the tablet. Her name was listed at the top of the form. Velira Sayeth, Kethani, Labor Class 4, Domestic Assignment, Contract Duration 6 months, Renewable by Mutual Agreement. Below that was a long list of things she was trained to do: cooking, cleaning, maintenance, schedule management, errands, household inventory. Below that was an even longer list of things she was not responsible for: emotional labor, companionship, personal conversation, beyond task-relevant communication, and something listed as effective proximity behaviors. I had no idea what that last one meant. I signed anyway. She walked past me into the apartment before I had even handed the tablet back. I watched her scan the room in about 3 seconds, the way you would scan a map. Her head moved in small, precise angles. Her eyes went from the window to the kitchen counter, to the pile of shoes I had left by the door, to the stack of books on the coffee table. She did not react to any of it. She simply catalogued it. "Your living space is disorganized," she said, without looking at me. "Yeah," I said. "That's kind of why I applied for the program." She turned her head toward me at that. A slight pause. Then she nodded once, the way you would acknowledge a correct answer on a test, and walked to the small supply bag she had placed on the floor near the entrance, and started removing things from it with mechanical efficiency. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should offer her something. Coffee, maybe, or tea. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The Kethani had been in contact with humanity for about 40 years. They were one of the first species to establish formal trade agreements with the colonial authority, mostly because they were good at math and humans were good at risk-taking, and those two qualities made for an efficient partnership in commerce. As a species, they were tall, slightly built, with pale skin that had a faint bluish undertone in certain light, and hair that was almost always dark, worn close to the head. Their facial features were sharp. Their expressions were sharper. They did not smile in the human sense, though they had their own version of it that mostly involved a very slight relaxation around the eyes that you could miss entirely if you were not paying attention. They also had a reputation. Not a bad one exactly, more like a precise one. The Kethani were known throughout the 47 inhabited systems as a people of control of emotion, of behavior, of environment. They did not raise their voices. They did not make impulsive decisions. They planned everything 3 steps ahead and found spontaneity mildly offensive. They were excellent workers, loyal contractors, and completely impossible to read. What they were not known for was warmth. That was the human word for it anyway. The Kethani had their own word, which translated roughly as the unnecessary risk of emotional exposure, and they considered it something to be avoided the way a sensible person avoids standing in the rain without a coat. The reason I knew all of this was that I had read the welcome packet the Colonial Labor Exchange sent me when my application was approved. 14 pages. I had read every single one. I was trying to be respectful. I wanted to get it right. The kettle finished boiling. I poured 2 cups and carried one to where Velira was now arranging my shoe rack, with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgical procedures. "I made tea," I said. "Do you drink tea?" She looked at the cup, then at me. "Kethani do not require hot beverages." "Right," I said. "But do you want one?" Another pause. Longer this time. "That is not a category I have been asked to evaluate." I set the cup on the small table near the door, within reach, and went back to the kitchen with my own cup. I did not make a thing of it. I just left it there. About 20 minutes later, when I was sitting on the couch reading, I heard a very small sound from the entryway, the sound of a cup being picked up. I did not look over. I kept reading. Her first week was interesting. Not difficult, not awkward, just interesting, in the way that having a new presence in a space you have lived alone in for 3 years is interesting. She moved through the apartment with a quietness that was not silence exactly, more like precision. She never bumped into things. She never knocked anything over. She placed every object back exactly where she had found it, or exactly where it was supposed to be if she had reorganized it, which she did 3 times in the first 4 days. She was good at her job, really good. The kitchen had never been so clean. The groceries were always fresh and sorted by type and expiration date. The laundry appeared folded on my bed, with a neatness that made me feel like a guest in a hotel. What she was not good at, or at least what she was clearly not comfortable with, was the small, normal human things I did without thinking. The first time I said good morning to her, she stopped in the middle of what she was doing and said, "It is 7:43, which is within the standard morning window." Acknowledged. Then she went back to wiping down the counter. The second morning, I just said morning. She said acknowledged again, but faster, like she had already prepared for it. By the 4th morning, she said morning back, quietly, with the same flat tone she used for everything, but she said it. I did not make a thing of that either. The note happened at the end of the first week. I had to go to a shift meeting, and she had a list of tasks to complete, which I had written out for her on a notepad, because she had said she preferred written task lists to verbal ones. At the bottom of the list, because I was in a hurry, and because I always did things like this, I had drawn a small smiley face and written, "Thanks, you're doing great." When I got home that evening, the tasks were all completed, the apartment was spotless, and the notepad was sitting on the kitchen counter with the task boxes all neatly checked. Under my message, written in her small, angular handwriting, were the words, "Task completion does not require emotional reinforcement." I laughed. Not at her. I just laughed because it was such a perfectly Kethani thing to say, and I thought it was sort of wonderful. I wrote back under that, "I know. I meant it anyway." I left the notepad there. She saw it the next morning. She did not respond in writing, but she made my coffee without being asked, and she had figured out exactly how I liked it, which no one in my life had ever gotten right on the first try. I did not mention it. I just drank it and said, "This is perfect. Thank you," and went to work. She watched me leave. She had not expected to feel anything about any of this. That was the truth she had not told the labor exchange when she signed her own contract. The truth she had not told her supervisor, or her sister worker, or anyone back home who had asked why she was taking a human assignment when there were perfectly adequate Vrothian households that needed staff. She had taken it because it paid well. That was it. That was the whole reason. The Kethani who had worked with humans before had come back talking about them the way travelers talk about a strange country they had visited, with a mixture of fascination and relief that they were home. They said humans were loud and emotional, and hopelessly sentimental, and that working with them was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with the actual labor, and everything to do with the constant low-level noise of their feelings, filling up every room they walked into. Valera had believed all of that. She had prepared for all of that. She had not prepared for him to leave the tea where she could reach it and then walk away. She had not prepared for the notes, the careful, cheerful, slightly messy handwriting, the small faces drawn in ink, the thanks that asked for nothing in return. By the end of the first week, she had filed her first internal report to the Kethani Labor Guild. She wrote it the night after she found his response on the notepad, sitting at the small desk in the room she had been given, with the lamp on and the rest of the apartment quiet. She wrote, "Employer displays consistent warmth-adjacent behaviors. Non-reciprocal positive reinforcement, given frequently. Cultural context suggests this is standard human socialization, not specific targeting. Emotional contamination risk, low to moderate. Situation is stable. Monitoring." She sent the report. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she went back to the kitchen and checked that tomorrow's grocery list was ready, and that his coffee was set to brew at 6:50, and that the notepad was still on the counter where she had left it. She did not touch it. She thought about it for a while. Then she went to bed. She had been told, by everyone who knew anything about humans, that the first sign of trouble was when you started thinking about them when they were not in the room. She had been told this was the beginning of what the Kethani called resonance bleed, the slow, involuntary process by which a highly ordered mind began to absorb and mirror the emotional patterns of a being whose feelings were large and persistent and constantly present. She had been told it was manageable, that discipline was sufficient, that any Kethani with proper training could maintain clear boundaries and return home at the end of a contract the same person they had been when they left. She had believed that too. She was starting to believe it slightly less. His name was Owen Calloway. He worked some kind of logistics coordination job for the Colonial Authority port system, which meant he spent most of his day managing cargo schedules and arguing with automated routing systems, and he came home every evening with the particular tiredness of someone who had spent 8 hours being technically correct and getting no credit for it. She recognized the pattern by the second week. She had started having dinner ready when he walked in without being asked, because it seemed like the most efficient thing to do given the observable data, and every time he sat down and said, "This smells great, thank you," with that same uncomplicated genuineness, she felt something in her chest do a thing she did not have a precise word for. She called it a calibration error. She made a note to monitor it. She also made him better coffee. Owen, for his part, had no idea any of this was happening. He just knew that coming home had stopped feeling like walking into an empty room, which was what it had felt like for a long time before she arrived, and that the apartment smelled like food in the evenings, and that someone had put a small plant on the windowsill without telling him about it, and that the plant made the window look much better than it had before. He had not asked about the plant, he had just watered it when it looked dry. She had noticed that too. She had not commented on it, but she added it to her internal log under the heading Unprompted Care Behaviors, which was a category she had created for him specifically, and which was getting very long. The question that started everything came on a Thursday evening, at the end of the second week. He came home late, later than usual, and quieter than usual, and he sat down at the kitchen table with his jacket still on, and did not say anything for a moment. She was finishing the dishes. She did not ask. She waited. After about 2 minutes, she said, without turning around, "Your posture indicates elevated stress. Do you want food now or in 30 minutes? He looked at her. She kept her back to him. 30 minutes, he said. Thank you. She nodded. She kept working. Then, after another pause, she heard him say, "Are you okay?" She went completely still. Among the Kethani, asking if someone was okay was not a casual question. It was a formal inquiry, used only when something had already gone visibly wrong. To ask if someone was okay before any visible evidence of distress was to imply that you had noticed something they had hidden, which was an accusation of weakness, which was deeply impolite unless you were a very close family member or a physician. She turned around slowly. Owen was looking at her with that open, uncomplicated expression he wore most of the time, and he had clearly asked the question the same way he asked every question, which was with absolutely no agenda behind it at all. "I am functioning normally," she said. "Yeah, I just thought you seemed a little quiet tonight," he said. "You don't have to answer. I was just checking." She stared at him. He had already looked back down at the table. He had asked because she seemed quiet. Not because she had made an error. Not because she had shown weakness. Not because anything was wrong. He had asked because she was quiet, and quietness, in a human, apparently registered as a signal that someone might need to be checked on, the way you would check a gauge on a piece of equipment, not to accuse it of failing, but simply to see how it was doing. She went back to the dishes. Her hands were steady. Her face was still. She filed her second report that night. She wrote, "Employer exhibits non-standard inquiry behavior. Question, are you okay?" Delivered without precedent of visible distress. Cultural analysis suggests this is a routine human checking behavior with no accusatory intent. Emotional contamination risk, moderate. Situation is becoming complex. Transfer request being drafted. She saved the report. She opened the transfer request form. She stared at it for a long time. She closed it without submitting. She sat in the quiet of her room and thought about the fact that in 17 days, no one had asked her if she was okay. Not once. Not her supervisor, not her sister worker, not her family. Because among the Kethani, you did not ask that unless something was already visibly broken. He had asked because she seemed quiet. She turned off the lamp and lay down, and looked at the ceiling, and thought that this was exactly the kind of thing she had been warned about. This was exactly how it started, not with anything dramatic or obvious, but with a small and simple thing that meant nothing to him, and meant more than she was prepared for to her. She told herself to sleep. She told herself she was being irrational. She told herself that resonance bleed was a documented condition, with documented countermeasures, and that she had the training and the discipline to manage it. She was asleep in about 40 minutes, which was 20 longer than usual. She dreamed about nothing in particular. But when she woke up in the morning, the first thing she thought about was whether he had slept all right. She considered that data point for exactly as long as it took the coffee to brew. Then she decided not to think about it, and went to start the morning. He was already in the kitchen when she got there. He was standing at the counter with a glass of water, still half asleep, his hair not entirely organized, and he looked up when she walked in and said, "Morning," and she said, "Morning," back, and he smiled at her. Not a big smile, just the small, automatic kind that humans did when they were glad something was where it was supposed to be. She went to start his coffee. She already knew how he liked it. That was the problem, she realized. She had started knowing things about him without trying to. The way he liked his coffee. The specific kind of tired that meant work had been bad, versus the kind that meant he just hadn't slept enough. The exact way he tilted his head when he was reading something he found interesting. The fact that he always watered the plant on Tuesdays and Fridays without being reminded. She knew these things the way you know a room after you have lived in it long enough, without thinking about it, without choosing to. She put his coffee on the counter and went to start breakfast. He said, "This smells amazing." 8 minutes later, still with his eyes half closed, and she felt that thing in her chest do the same thing it always did when he said something like that. She made a very firm note to herself to monitor it more closely. She also, without deciding to, made his eggs exactly the way he liked them. The day Owen left for his off-world trip, the apartment changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to anyone else. But Velfira felt it within about 2 hours of him walking out the door with his carry bag over one shoulder, and it was not a comfortable feeling. He had told her the night before. Standard 3-day logistics audit at the Kessel Station transfer hub, routine, nothing to worry about. He had left her a printed list of everything she might need, emergency contacts, building maintenance codes, his preferred takeout orders in case she wanted something delivered, a note about watering the plant. At the bottom of the list, in the same slightly messy handwriting she had catalogued and indexed and tried very hard not to think about too much, he had written, "Back soon." That was it. 2 words and a small drawing. She had read it 3 times. Then she had told herself she was analyzing text content for completeness and put the list on the kitchen counter and gone to start her day. The first day without him was fine. She was a Kethani. She had been trained in emotional regulation since childhood. She cleaned the apartment, which was already clean. She reorganized the pantry, which she had reorganized 2 weeks ago. She checked the inventory list, and placed a grocery order, and processed the household accounts, and did every task on her schedule with complete efficiency. She was very efficient. She was also, in a way she could not quite categorize with the vocabulary available to her, aware of every room he was not in. This was, she knew, a documented symptom. The Kethani texts she had read on resonance bleed described it as environmental absence response, which was when a subject began mapping the presence of a specific individual onto their physical surroundings to such a degree that the individual's absence became perceptible as a kind of altered texture in the space. In plain terms, it meant that a room felt different when the person you had become accustomed to was not in it. She stood in the kitchen on the first evening and made herself dinner, which was the first meal she had cooked in this apartment that was not also for him, and ate it at the table in complete silence. She did not find the silence restful. This was new. She had always found silence restful. Silence was the default state of a well-ordered environment. Silence meant everything was functioning as intended. She had spent most of her life preferring it. She finished her meal. She washed her single plate and single set of utensils. She watered the plant because it was a Tuesday. She went to bed. She lay awake for an hour and a half. On the second day, she read. She had been working her way through the books on his shelf, not as assigned reading, but because she had started one of them, while dusting, and kept going, and then kept going, and then needed to know what happened at the end. His books were an interesting collection. Some were technical. Some were history. Some were fiction. The human kind, which had a looseness to it that Kethani literature did not. A willingness to sit inside a feeling for a long time without resolving it. She had found this maddening at first, and was now finding it, very quietly, something else. She read for most of the second day. She also researched. She sat with her communicator and looked up information she had been putting off looking up, which was the full text of the Venketh passage in the old Kethani settlement records. The Venketh, the warmth sickness, had been documented over 300 years ago, when the Kethani had their first sustained contact with humanity. A handful of Kethani workers and diplomats who had spent extended periods among humans had come back changed, not broken, not dysfunctional, just changed. Warmer in the literal sense that their baseline emotional temperature, which in Kethani terms meant their willingness to engage with feeling instead of managing it from a distance, had shifted. The old scholars had written about it with concern. They had recommended shorter contact periods. They had designed the emotional regulation protocols that were still taught today. They had also noted, in the final paragraph of the passage, which most people skipped, that of the Kethani who had contracted the Venketh, not one of them had ever reported wishing they hadn't. Velkalira read that paragraph twice. Then she put her communicator down and stared at the window. The plant was on the sill. She had watered it yesterday. Owen watered it on Tuesdays and Fridays. She watered it when it looked dry. Between the two of them, the plant was getting more water than any plant reasonably needed, and yet it was thriving. She had a thought, which was that this was probably what happened when two different people both cared about the same thing without coordinating about it. You got overlap. You got more than enough. You got a very healthy plant. She wrote down that thought in her personal log, not the guild report, the other one, the one she had started keeping in the second week without quite deciding to. She titled the entry Overlap and left it at that. On the morning of the third day, she received a message from her sister worker, Dakhaven, who worked for a human family in the Port District and had been doing so for 2 years and was by all accounts deeply comfortable and completely unworried about resonance bleed. The message said, "You have gone quiet. This means one of two things. Either you are fine and busy, or you are experiencing significant resonance, bleed and not telling anyone. I know which one I think it is. Call me." Valira did not call her. She sent a message that said, "I am fine and busy." Daven sent back a single word, liar. Valira put her communicator in her room and went to clean the bathroom, which did not need cleaning, and thought about whether she was lying. She decided she was not lying exactly. She was fine. She was functioning. She was completing her tasks. She was maintaining her schedule. By every measurable standard, she was performing at full capacity. She was also, measurably, sitting in a stranger's apartment, thinking about when he was coming back, and had been doing so for 53 hours. She cleaned the bathroom anyway. It was spotless by the end. He came back a day early. She was in the kitchen when she heard the door, and her first response, before she had time to regulate it, was a complete and total dissolution of every low-level tension she had been holding for 3 days. It was not dramatic. Nothing changed outwardly. She did not move from where she was standing. But inside, in the place she usually kept very quiet, something that had been braced for a long time, simply relaxed. She heard him set his bag down. She heard him say, "Oh, that smells good. What is that?" Even though she had not started cooking yet, and the only thing he could possibly be smelling was the general condition of a clean and well-maintained kitchen. She thought, not for the first time, that humans sometimes said things not because they were literally true, but because they were glad, and they needed to say something to express it. And, "That smells good," was easier than, "I am glad to be here." She understood that. She had not always understood it. She understood it now. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his carry bag still on his shoulder, and his hair slightly disordered from travel, and an expression on his face that was, in the precise vocabulary of Kethani emotional analysis, openly and uncomplicatedly happy to see her. "You are back early," she said. "Flight got rerouted," he said. "I tried to message, but the station comms were down. Sorry, I should have warned you." "It is fine," she said. "Are you hungry?" "Starving," he said, which she had learned was not literal. She started cooking. He went to put his bag in his room and came back and sat at the table, and they were in the kitchen together again, and the room felt like itself again, and she did not say any of this out loud, because there was no good way to say it that would not be too much. He told her about the audit. She listened. He was a good talker when he was tired, loose and detailed, and she liked hearing about the logistics problems he dealt with, because they were the kind of problems she found genuinely interesting, all moving parts and cascading effects, and the specific human capacity to find a workaround when the system failed. She made him food. He ate it and said, "This is so good," with the simple honesty she had stopped trying to dismiss and had started simply receiving. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and put something on the table between them. It was a small stone, dark gray, smooth, with a faint blue-green mineral vein running through it. "Got it at the station market," he said. "One of those little local geology shops. I don't know why I bought it. It just reminded me of your eyes." She looked at the stone. She looked at him. He was not watching her with any particular intensity. He had already looked back at his plate, the way he always did after saying something like that, as if he said things like that every day, because to him, in a sense, he did. He just said what he noticed. He had noticed the stone. He had thought of her. He had bought it and brought it back. Among the Kethani, gifts were formal. They were given to settle obligations, to mark significant occasions, to communicate status. A gift between equals did not exist as a concept, because the closest word meant tribute from a supplicant, or payment against a debt. To give someone something for no reason, simply because you had seen it and thought of them, was not a category that existed. She did not know what to do with the stone. She picked it up. It was smooth and cool, and fit perfectly in her palm. "Thank you," she said, because he had taught her, slowly and without meaning to, that thank you was not an acknowledgement of debt, but simply a way of saying that something had mattered. "Sure," he said, and kept eating. She held the stone in her hand all through dinner, and when she cleared the table, she carried it to her room and set it on her desk next to her lamp. She looked at it for a while. Then she opened her communicator and started a message to Davin. She typed, "You were right." Then she stopped. Then she added, "Do not say anything." Then she sent it, and closed the communicator, and sat with the stone in her hands, and thought about eyes and minerals, and the specific way a human said, "I thought of you," by doing something instead of saying it. She extended her contract the next morning. She did it quietly, through the Guild app, before he was awake. 6 months extended to indefinite, pending mutual agreement. The confirmation came back in under a minute. She set her communicator down. She went to start the coffee. When he came out of his room and saw that she had extended it, because she told him directly, rather than waiting for him to ask, he had looked at her for a moment, with that open expression she had stopped trying to categorize. Then he said, "I'm really glad," in exactly the same tone he used for everything, simple and clear, and with nothing hidden in it. She said, "I know," and handed him his coffee. She walked back to the kitchen. She did not let him see that the thing in her chest had stopped being something she was monitoring and had become something she was, very quietly and without any plan, beginning to let stay. It had been 3 weeks since the stone, 4 since the extended contract. In that time, several things had happened in the specific, compounding way that things happened around humans, which was that one small thing led to another, and the other led somewhere she had not anticipated. And she was beginning to think that this was simply what life near humans was like. Not chaotic, not disordered, just alive in a way that her own people's lives sometimes were not. She had told Davin about the Venketh. She had not called it that. She had described the symptoms in clinical terms, the resonance bleed, the environmental absence response, the involuntary mirroring, and Davin had listened to all of it, and then said, "Vel ira, that is love." Vel ira had said, "That is not a precise translation." Davin had said, "It is a precise enough translation." They had not spoken for 2 days after that, which was as close to an argument as they ever got, and then Davin had sent her a long message full of practical advice, none of which was about the Venketh, and all of which was about what to do when you realized you were in a situation you had not planned for, and were not sure you wanted to leave. The advice could be summarized as, be careful, be honest, and stop pretending you are fine. Valera was trying. The situation became formally complicated on a Tuesday. She was in the middle of reorganizing the bookshelf, something she did when she wanted to feel useful and when the actual tasks were all done, and her communicator sounded with a message from the Kethani Labor Guild regional office. The message was polite. It was precise. It informed her that based on her contract extension request, a standard welfare assessment had been automatically triggered for any Kethani worker who extended a human employer assignment past 6 months. The assessment would include a visit from a cultural liaison from her community. The visit was scheduled for the following week. She read the message twice. Then she called Davin. "They are sending someone," she said. Davin was quiet for a moment. "Who?" "The message says cultural liaison. That means family." Another pause. "Which family member?" "Based on the regional office, it would be my father's sister. Elder Sayeth." Davin made a small sound. "That is the worst possible option." "Yes," Valera said. "I know." Elder Sayeth was not cruel. She was not unkind. She was simply the most Kethani person Valera had ever known, which was saying something in a species of people who considered emotional restraint a civic virtue. She had written papers on resonance bleed. She had designed 2 of the emotional regulation protocols that Valera had trained on. She was the person the guild called when they needed someone to bring a worker home. Valera had not told Owen any of this. She had not told Owen most of this. She had not told him about the Venketh, or the reports, or the extended contract meaning something different in Kethani terms than it did in colonial labor exchange terms. She had not told him because she had not found a way to say any of it that did not sound like more than she was ready for it to be. She cleaned the apartment. She made lists. She prepared. On the day of the visit, she also, without quite meaning to, made a lunch that was large enough for 4 people instead of 2. When Owen came home that evening, she was in the kitchen, and she said to him, as he set down his bag, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. He sat down at the table. He did not say anything, which was one of the things about him she had come to find remarkable, the fact that when someone was about to say something, he made room for it first. She told him about the visit. She told him a liaison was coming to assess her welfare and determine whether she should be reassigned. She told him that this was standard procedure, but that Elder Sayeth was not a standard liaison. She did not tell him everything, but she told him enough. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then he said, "Do you want to stay?" She said yes. He said, "Okay." That was it. No plan, no scheme, no strategy. He simply believed her and moved forward. Which was, she was beginning to understand, the most human thing he ever did. Elder Sayeth arrived the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, which was the standard time for formal visits. She was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in the kind of clothing that communicated cultural authority without being obvious about it. She looked at the apartment the way Valera had looked at it on the first day, cataloging and precise. Valera introduced her to Owen. Owen shook her hand, which Elder Sayeth permitted with the careful tolerance of someone accepting a customs she found unnecessary, and said, "It's great to meet you. Can I get you anything? Tea, water, something to eat? I made too much lunch." Elder Sayeth looked at the table, where there was, genuinely, too much lunch. She said, in Kethani, to Valera, "He cooked?" Valera said, also in Kethani, "We cooked. It is the meal we usually have on Tuesdays." Elder Sayeth took a very small breath. Then she sat down at the table. Owen, who did not speak Kethani, had already started putting food on plates. He was telling Elder Sayeth about the logistics routing problem he had been working on that week, something about a cargo delay out of the 4th station, and he was telling it the way he always told stories, which was with enough detail to be interesting, and enough honesty about his own frustration to be human. Elder Sayeth listened. She ate the food. She asked one precise question about the routing problem, which was a technical one, and Owen answered it, and she nodded in the way that meant he was correct. This continued for an hour. At the end of it, Elder Sayeth asked to speak to Valera privately. They stood in the small hallway near the front door. Owen had gone to do something in the kitchen, giving them space without being asked. Elder Sayeth said, "In Kethani, you have contracted the Venketh." Valera said, "Yes." This was what we feared. I know. Elder Sayeth was quiet for a moment. She looked toward the kitchen, where they could hear Owen moving around, the sound of a tap running, a cabinet opening. She said, "He does not know. He knows some. Does he know what it means? In full?" Valera said, "No, not yet." Another silence. Elder Sayeth looked back at her. Her expression was the most complicated Valera had ever seen on her face, which for a Kethani was not very complicated in human terms but was significant. She said, "We came to bring you home. That was the intent." "I know." "I'm going to recommend a continued assessment period instead." Valera looked at her. "Why?" Elder Sayeth looked toward the kitchen again. From inside came the sound of Owen saying, to no one visible, "I found the good cups, hang on." She said, very quietly, "Because the danger of the Venketh was always described to us as a loss of control. But I have been sitting in that room for 1 hour, and what I see does not look like a loss of control. It looks like something else." Valera waited. Elder Sayeth said, "I will need to think about what to call it." Then she went back to the table and accepted the good cup that Owen had found. And she stayed for another hour, and when she left, she shook Owen's hand again, and this time, she did not look like she found it unnecessary. She looked, Valera thought, like someone who was revising a very old belief and was not entirely unhappy about it. The second memo came that night. Valera sat at her desk and wrote it and sent it to the guild. She wrote, "Assessment completed. Elder Sayeth has recommended continued monitoring in lieu of reassignment. Emotional contamination risk, high. Situation is not what was feared. No further action requested at this time." She saved the file. She sat in the quiet. She picked up the stone from her desk. She turned it over in her hand, that dark gray thing with the blue-green vein, the one he had carried back from a station on another planet, because it reminded him of her eyes. She set it back down. She turned off the lamp. She thought, in the dark, that the old scholars had been right about one thing and wrong about another. They were right that the Venketh changed you. They were wrong that this was something to be afraid of. What changed you was not the feeling itself. It was the fact that the feeling was answered. That was the thing no one had written about, the specific condition of being seen by a creature who looked at the whole universe with open eyes and simply told you what they noticed, without agenda, without calculation, without anything except the mild and persistent certainty that you were worth noticing. That was what made the Kethani call humans the fevered ones. Not because humans were dangerous, because humans were warm. And warmth, it turned out, was not something you could argue yourself out of wanting, once you had been close enough to feel it. She closed her eyes. She slept in 11 minutes, which was the fastest she had slept in months. The morning was ordinary. She rose at the usual time. The lamp came on. She dressed. She went to the kitchen. He was already there, standing at the window with a cup of water, looking at the plant. He had watered it. She had watered it yesterday. The plant was doing extraordinarily well. He turned when he heard her and said, "Morning," and she said, "Morning," and went to start the coffee. She had known since Elder Sayeth's visit that there was something she needed to do. Not because of the guild, not because of the assessment, not because of anything external, because of the stone on her desk and the thing she had been letting stay in her chest for months without saying anything about it. She had been thinking about what to say for 3 weeks. She had drafted it in her head several times. She had dismissed every draft because none of them sounded right. None of them captured the specific weight of what she meant, without either being too small or too much. She had eventually decided that precision was not going to serve her here, that sometimes the most honest thing was the simplest thing. She set his coffee on the counter. She turned around. He was looking at her. She said, "I need to tell you something. The rest of it." He put his cup down. He did not say anything. He made room. She told him about the Venketh. Not in clinical terms this time, not with reports or categories, or the careful distance of a worker filing a guild memo. She told him what it actually was. The permanent changing of a cold nature by another's heat. The fact that in 300 years of documented cases, not one Kethani who had contracted it had ever reported wishing they hadn't. She told him about the missing that she didn't have a word for, about the environmental absence response, and then she told him what that actually felt like, which was that every room he was not in felt slightly wrong, the way a sentence feels wrong when a word is missing from it. She told him about the extended contract and what that meant in Kethani terms. Not a renewal of employment, a declaration of intent. She told him about the stone, that she still had it, that she always would. She said all of this standing at the kitchen counter with her hands at her sides and her voice steady, because she was Kethani, and she had been trained all her life to be steady, and also because some part of her was very aware that she was doing the most frightening thing she had ever done, and she needed to stay standing. Owen was quiet the whole time. He did not interrupt. He did not rush her. When she finished, there was a silence, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that has weight in it. He said, "Thank you for telling me all of it." She said, "You deserve to know all of it." He said, "Can I tell you something now?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The day you extended the contract, I looked up what Venketh meant, because you had used the word once, in Kethani, when you were talking to your sister worker, and didn't know I was nearby. I looked it up. I read the whole passage, the old scholars one." She stared at him. He said, "I read the last paragraph too, the one that says none of them ever wished they hadn't." She did not speak. He said, "I was going to bring it up. I didn't know how. And then you were already telling me so." He stopped. He looked at her with that open, uncomplicated expression. "I'm glad you told me," she said, because there was nothing more precise to say, and precision was not what this moment needed. "I am glad you read the last paragraph." He smiled. Not a small, automatic smile this time, a real one. She felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped monitoring and started accepting do something she could only describe as expansion, as if it had been a certain size and had now decided to be larger, as if it had been waiting for permission. She said, "I do not know the human word for what this is." He said, "I think we probably mean the same thing." She thought about that. "Your language has many words for it." "Yeah," he said. "We overthink it." She almost smiled. Very close. The corners of her eyes changed. He saw it. He did not mention it. He just looked like he was quietly very glad about it. She turned back to the stove. She started breakfast. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and the plant on the windowsill was thriving in the excessive way of things that are cared for by two people at once, and she thought that this was what the old scholars had missed, what all the warnings and the protocols and the carefully designed distance had missed. They had described the Venketh as a sickness, a contamination, a loss of the cold they had always believed was strength. They had not considered the possibility that what felt like a loss was also a finding. She cooked his eggs the way he liked them. He made extra toast because she had once, briefly, eaten a piece of his toast and said it was acceptable, which in her vocabulary meant she liked it very much. They ate at the table together, and the morning went on, and neither of them said anything for a while, because the quiet between them had stopped being a distance and become something else entirely, something she still did not have one perfect word for, and was starting to think maybe she did not need. She had the stone. She had the plant. She had the coffee. Exactly right. Made by the person who had learned how she liked it the same way she had learned how he liked his, which was to say, without asking, and without making a thing of it. She had this kitchen, and this window, and this ordinary Tuesday morning. She had decided, without announcing it, that she intended to keep all of it. She thought, as she cleared the plates, that the Kethani texts had been right, that the Venketh was permanent. She was simply no longer filing it under the category of warnings. She rinsed the dishes. He dried them. They had started doing this recently, not because it was more efficient, it was not, but because it was the kind of thing you did when you did not want to be on separate sides of a task. She handed him the last plate. He said, "You know you don't have to do the dishes. That's technically in your job description." She said without looking up from the sink, "I am not doing them as part of my job description." A pause. He said, "Oh?" She said, "Yes." He dried the plate. He put it away. He stood next to her for a moment, with the dish towel in his hand, and she was very aware of how close he was, and found, for the first time in a very long time, that she did not want to calculate the distance. He said, I leave notes on the notepad. She said, I know. He said, I'm going to keep leaving them. She said, I know that too. A small silence. Then, quietly, she said, I may start writing back. He turned to look at her. She did not turn to look at him, but she felt his gaze the way you feel the sun, not painful, just present. He said, I'd really like that. She said, I thought you would. And she handed him the last cup to dry, and the morning kept going, and outside the window, the plant caught the light, and she thought that 300 years of scholars had written about the Venketh as if it were the end of something. They were wrong. It was, it turned out, a beginning. She had come to his door with a contract in one hand and a memo already drafting in her head. She had come prepared to stay professional, to stay distant, to stay exactly who she had always been. She had not prepared for the tea left within reach. The notes with small faces drawn at the bottom. The question asked simply because she had seemed quiet. She had not prepared for the stone that matched her eyes. She had not prepared to want more. But she did. Every morning she did. She wanted more of this kitchen, and this window, and this ordinary life, and this specific human who said what he noticed, and meant what he said, and had read the last paragraph, and never made her feel like what she was becoming was anything other than something worth being. She put the dish towel on the rack. She looked at the plant. She thought, this is what the warmth sickness actually is. Not a fever, not a loss, just the very human, and now also the very hers, experience of finding something you had no plan for, and choosing it anyway. She thought, I am going to keep choosing it. She did not say any of this out loud. She went to write him a note instead. Small, neat handwriting, a task list with everything checked. And at the bottom, in the space where he always put his small face with its curved line of a mouth, she drew her own. Angular, Githani-shaped. Not quite right, because she had never drawn a face before, because her people did not do this. But close enough. She put the notepad on the counter where he would find it. She went to start the rest of the day. The door to his room opened a few minutes later. She heard him cross the kitchen. She heard him stop. She heard the very small sound of someone picking up a piece of paper. Then, from behind her, quiet and warm, and completely uncomplicated, she heard him say, Hey. She said, without turning around, Good morning. You drew a face, he said. I was attempting the format, she said. A pause. It's perfect. She did not respond. She kept her hands busy at the counter. But she let herself, just for a moment, feel the full weight of that. Let it be what it was. Let it stay. She thought. Yes. She thought. I want more of this. Every day. Every ordinary, excessive, warmth-filled day. She thought, I believe I have decided to be the kind of Kethani the old scholars could never have predicted. She thought, I am not afraid of that anymore. She kept cooking. He kept the note. And that was more than enough to begin with.